It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when I first encountered the HOA Karen. The sun was shining, the lawn had been freshly mowed, and I was sipping a cup of coffee on my porch, enjoying the calm of the suburban lake I called home. My house, a modest but comfortable two-story, sat near the edge of the water, offering me a serene view that I had come to cherish after years of city life. This quiet neighborhood was everything I had ever wanted. Peaceful, orderly, and, at least up until this point, free from the chaotic entanglements that often come with tightly knit communities. For years, I had been living under the radar, avoiding the HOA's incessant requests, attending their meetings only when absolutely necessary, and adhering to their ever-growing list of rules just enough to keep things smooth. But things were about to change. It started with Karen. She wasn't just a regular neighbor. She was the president of the lake's HOA, and not just any president. She was a woman who had an unmatched passion for rules, regulations, and making sure that every resident followed them to the letter. The only problem was, I wasn't one to follow orders, especially from someone like her. Karen's version of community standards was less about maintaining harmony and more about exercising control. She had been persistent in her attempts to get me to join her HOA. It started as a casual conversation when I bumped into her outside while taking out the trash. Karen, with her clipboard and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, asked me if I'd considered becoming a member of the Lake HOA. "I really think you'd enjoy the benefits of being involved," she said, as if the word benefits was some magic key that would unlock my compliance. I politely declined, mentioning that I preferred to manage my property and my life without too much oversight. She wasn't deterred. Over the course of a few weeks, Karen's invitations became increasingly frequent. She sent letters, left flyers on my doorstep, and even tried to corner me at the mailbox, all while reciting the HOA's incredible benefits, which seemed more like a set of restrictions than anything else. From what I gathered, the HOA promised better lawn care tips, access to exclusive neighborhood events, which mostly sounded like boring meetings, and a vague sense of community that seemed more like a thinly veiled excuse to control how everyone lived. But I wasn't buying it. Karen's constant pressure made it clear that she was used to getting her way, that being the HOA president gave her an inflated sense of entitlement. But when she sent me yet another letter, this time with a bold, underlined request that I sign up for the HOA by the end of the month, I decided it was time to stand my ground. I didn't join. I refused outright. What I didn't know, however, was how far Karen would go to get what she wanted. I had no idea that refusing to join her little HOA would be the catalyst for a storm that would soon sweep through my peaceful life. I didn't realize it at the time, but Karen was about to escalate things. This wasn't just about a neighborhood organization anymore. This was about her, personally, taking it as a challenge. And she wasn't the type to back down easily. Later that day, I was enjoying the evening, relaxing in the backyard, when I saw a police car pulling into my driveway. Confusion hit me immediately. Why was a police officer here? I hadn't been involved in any incidents. My lawn was well maintained, my dogs were inside, and everything was quiet. As the officer got out of the car and approached me, a sense of unease washed over me. I could feel the cold knot of tension in my stomach, and I braced myself for whatever reason had brought the police to my doorstep. I could see the officer was looking down at his notes, his expression neutral, but it wasn't enough to ease the growing discomfort I felt. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his voice official but not unfriendly. "We've had a complaint filed regarding your property." My mind raced. "A complaint?" I echoed. "About what?" The officer continued. "It's in regard to your refusal to join the Lake HOA. The president of the HOA, a Karen last name, has stated that you're disrupting the peace of the neighborhood by not participating, and that your decision is creating a hostile environment." He glanced at his notes. "She's asking that we step in to mediate." I blinked, stunned. So this was how it was going to be? Karen, the HOA president, had called the police over something so trivial? Felt surreal. "Wait, hold on," I said, trying to make sense of it. "I'm not violating any laws. I simply didn't want to join the HOA. What's the issue?" The officer shrugged slightly, looking a little uncomfortable with the absurdity of the situation. "Honestly, sir, I don't know. I'm just here to pass along the complaint." He sighed, adding, "I don't have the power to do much in this case, but I'll report this back to her." As the officer left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. It wasn't just about a simple disagreement anymore. Karen wasn't the type to just let things go, and she had now involved the authorities in an attempt to bully me into compliance. It felt like the start of something much bigger, and I could sense that her next move wouldn't be far behind. I stood there, watching the police car drive off into the distance, my mind spinning. I was just trying to live my life quietly, yet here I was, caught in a battle I never asked for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was personal, and I wasn't going to back down. The next few days were quiet, but the silence was unsettling. I could feel it in the air, like the calm before a storm. Karen, the HOA president, had made her move, involving the police over a simple refusal. But something told me that wouldn't be enough for her. I wasn't wrong. On the morning following the officer's visit, a letter arrived. Not a usual HOA letter, this one was different. It was addressed to me personally, and in large bold print, it read, "Legal action pending. Final notice." I opened the envelope with trepidation, knowing full well it wasn't going to be just another benign request about lawn care or the color of my mailbox. As I read the letter, my stomach tightened. Karen had escalated things further. She had taken it upon herself to file a lawsuit against me for violating community peace by refusing to join her HOA. The letter warned of potential fines, injunctions, and even the possibility of a court-ordered settlement. All of this just because I didn't want to be part of her group. The audacity was astounding. I hadn't just declined an invitation. I had apparently become an enemy. I wasn't just another resident of the neighborhood anymore. I had become a target of Karen's own personal crusade. As I reread the letter, my thoughts raced. How far was she willing to take this? I had heard stories of HOA presidents being overzealous, but this was something else entirely. She had gone from sending polite invitations to calling the police, and now she was taking legal action against me over something as trivial as a membership refusal. And I had to admit it was working. My anxiety was through the roof. I had no idea what to expect next, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and let her push me around. I immediately contacted my lawyer, a no-nonsense, sharp-witted professional who had helped me with property disputes in the past. After listening to my recount of events, including Karen's harassment, the police visit, and the recent legal threat, he made one thing clear. Karen was out of line. "This is classic HOA overreach," my lawyer said, clearly frustrated by the absurdity of the situation. "But you can't just ignore this. We're going to need to take action to protect your rights, and if it comes down to it, we can counter-sue for harassment. I'll get the ball rolling immediately." His words gave me some comfort. At least now I had a plan. But it was clear. This situation was escalating rapidly, and I needed to be prepared for the fallout. Karen, it seemed, wasn't going to stop until I was fully in her grasp, either by force or by law. I spent the rest of the day sorting through documents, consulting with my lawyer, and mentally preparing for whatever came next. I wasn't about to let her win, but I could feel the pressure mounting. How far would she go? A few days later, I got the answer. The evening sun was dipping low behind the trees when I noticed a car pulling into my driveway. At first, I thought it was just a delivery or a neighbor passing by, but as the car came to a stop, I saw the unmistakable figure of Karen stepping out, clipboard in hand, wearing that same disingenuous smile that made my skin crawl. She walked up my driveway with a confident, almost smug, air. Her eyes, hidden behind oversized sunglasses, were locked on me as if she were walking into a victory. Before I could say anything, she spoke, her tone dripping with false politeness. "I see you've been ignoring our legal proceedings," she said, her voice bright and sing-song. "I thought I'd come by personally to remind you of the consequences." I froze. Consequences? This wasn't just a woman at my door. This was a self-appointed judge and jury, ready to impose her will. I took a deep breath, refusing to let her provoke me. I had already been through enough with this woman, and now it seemed that Karen's personal vendetta had turned into a full-on campaign. "What do you want, Karen?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. "I'm just here to make sure you understand the seriousness of your actions," she said, her eyes glinting with a mix of superiority and contempt. "Your refusal has disrupted the peace of this community. You've ignored all our communications, and now we'll have to escalate things further." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Escalation. It was a word I had come to dread. It seemed Karen had no intention of letting this go. As she continued to stand in front of me, still smiling, I realized something. She was not going to stop until she broke me. She was about to say something else, no doubt more condescending words aimed at wearing me down. When I heard it, the unmistakable sound of another car pulling into my driveway. It was my neighbor, Steve. He had been a good friend ever since I moved in, and he had watched the entire scene from his front porch, no doubt perplexed by Karen's presence. Steve stepped out of his car, a raised eyebrow signaling his curiosity, and walked up toward the front door. As he got closer, I could see the flicker of realization in his eyes when he saw Karen standing there, a clipboard in hand. He had been around long enough to know what this meant. Steve shot me a look, then directed his attention toward Karen. "I don't think I've seen you around here before," Steve said coolly, eyeing Karen with a skeptical gaze. "Is there a problem?" Karen was visibly annoyed, but she wasn't backing down. "I'm here to discuss a matter of community importance," she replied, though her tone lacked the usual charm. "I'm sure you can understand that this is about the well-being of our neighborhood." Steve, never one to back down from a confrontation, crossed his arms and leaned slightly toward Karen. "I've been living here for years, and I've never heard of an HOA that goes around sending threats to people just because they don't want to join. You really think this is the kind of thing that makes the neighborhood better?" Karen's expression faltered, but she quickly recovered, straightening her posture as if she had the upper hand. "I'm just doing what's necessary to keep this place nice," she said, her voice dripping with patronization. "Maybe if everyone followed the rules, this place wouldn't be in chaos." But Steve wasn't finished. "You're the one making it chaotic, Karen," he shot back, his voice loud enough for Karen to realize she wasn't in full control. "You're pushing people around, making them feel like they don't belong unless they follow you. That's not nice. That's bullying." Karen's face reddened. The atmosphere was tense, and for a moment, I thought she might snap. But instead, she let out a tight, forced laugh. "Perhaps you'll see it differently when you receive your own letter," she said before turning, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked away without another word. As Karen retreated, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. Steve turned to me with a wry smile. "Unbelievable, huh?" he asked. "She really doesn't give up." I nodded, shaking my head. This was only the beginning. The days that followed Karen's visit were tense. The neighborhood felt different. A charged atmosphere lingered in the air, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. I had been warned about the HOA, but I had never imagined it would escalate this quickly. What had started as a simple refusal to join her little club had now morphed into an all-out war. The community, once peaceful and quiet, was beginning to fracture. It wasn't just Karen anymore. She had made her move, and now others in the neighborhood were taking sides. The question that loomed over everyone's heads was, who would stand with her, and who would stand with me? I wasn't naive. Karen had already started pulling strings. She was relentless, and her tactics were becoming more transparent with each passing day. The HOA wasn't just a group of people who enforced rules. It was her personal power trip. But I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. Still, I knew this was going to be tough. The first real indication of just how far Karen would go came a few days after her confrontation at my house. The neighbors who had been silent during the whole ordeal began to speak up. Some offered support, others kept their distance, and a few, the ones I hadn't expected, took Karen's side. It wasn't long before I saw the first signs of division. It started with a conversation I overheard at the local coffee shop. I had stopped in for my usual cup of coffee needing some time away from the tension at home. As I stood in line, I overheard two of my neighbors, Carol and Mike, talking about the recent events in the neighborhood. I had seen Carol at a few HOA meetings, and Mike lived a few houses down from me, but I never imagined they'd take sides. Mike was speaking, his voice low but clear enough for me to catch every word. "Honestly, I think Karen's just doing what's best for the neighborhood," Mike said, his tone surprisingly approving. "We can't let people just break the rules and get away with it. It's about maintaining property values and order." Carol, who had always been friendly enough, sounded less convinced. "I don't know, Mike. It feels like Karen's overstepping her bounds. I mean, all he did was refuse to join, right? Is that really worth this much trouble?" Mike didn't hesitate. "You don't get it, Carol. This is how it starts. If we let people like him get away with ignoring the rules, it sets a bad precedent. Next thing you know, people will start parking RVs in their front yards and painting their houses neon green. It's a slippery slope." I stood there, stunned. Was this how people were viewing the situation? Karen had spun her story so convincingly that even the most reasonable neighbors were starting to question my actions. I didn't know whether to feel frustrated or just defeated. It felt like the community I had been part of was slowly slipping away, divided by one woman's need to control everything. I left the coffee shop feeling more unsettled than when I walked in. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. She was winning hearts and minds. I had to do something that would rally the community around me and make people see Karen for what she truly was. A bully who was abusing her power. That afternoon, I received another surprise. This time, it wasn't from Karen, but from another neighbor, Steve. He had become my unexpected ally since our confrontation with Karen. I had suspected he might side with me, but when he dropped by my house unannounced, I knew this was more than just casual neighborly advice. Steve was serious. "I've been talking to a few people around here, and it's clear not everyone is on Karen's side," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "But we need to organize. The only way we'll get her to back off is if we make a stand. She's not going to stop unless she knows she can't do this without a fight." I knew he was right. I couldn't do this alone. But organizing wasn't going to be easy. It would take more than a few casual conversations. We needed to take action, to show everyone what Karen was really doing to the neighborhood. We started with small steps. Steve and I began talking to the neighbors who had shown even a little bit of support. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation from Karen and the HOA, but others were eager to join the fight. I could feel the momentum shifting, just a little, but Karen wasn't going to let it slide. She had her sights set on me, and she wasn't going to back down. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with neighbors, and strategizing. We began organizing a small group, just a handful of people at first, to stand against the HOA's overreach. We weren't asking for anything grand, just the right to be left alone, to live our lives without the constant threat of Karen's interference. Then, one evening, the unthinkable happened. A police car pulled up to my driveway. It wasn't just any car. It was the same officer who had come to my house the first time Karen had called them. I didn't know whether to laugh or get angry. Felt like a bad joke. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, and approached my door. The look in his eyes was familiar. It wasn't suspicion, but it was certainly disapproval. "Evening," he said, looking at me with a mix of caution and professionalism. "We've had another complaint from the HOA. Seems they've gotten some reports about noise complaints coming from your property. They've asked for an inspection to make sure you're not violating any local ordinances." Noise complaints? My jaw nearly dropped. This was getting ridiculous. I knew right away that this was more of Karen's work. She was using every tactic in the book to wear me down, trying to intimidate me into submitting. But I wasn't going to give in. As I escorted the officer around my yard, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about a refusal to join her HOA. This was about her trying to control everything, trying to make me bend to her will. The officer, after a cursory inspection, gave me a brief nod. "No violations found," he said, almost apologetically. "But we'll be keeping an eye on things. I suggest you keep things quiet here." And with that, he left. I closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. The police visit had been nothing more than a farce. Another attempt by Karen to assert her power. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following the police visit were a blur of increasing tension and whispers in the neighborhood. It felt like I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next move from Karen or the HOA. I had done everything right, followed the rules, respected the community, and yet here I was the target of an all-out attack. The more I resisted, the more relentless Karen became. I couldn't ignore the growing divide in the neighborhood. Some of the residents were still loyal to the HOA, fearful of the consequences of standing up to Karen. But there were others who, like me, were fed up with her control. They saw the truth. This wasn't about rules or regulations anymore. It was about one woman using her position to bully everyone around her. The turning point came one evening when I received an unexpected call. It was from Steve, who had become more than just a neighbor at this point. He was a vital ally, and I could sense his urgency in the phone call. "Look, things are heating up," he said, his voice filled with a sense of purpose. "I've spoken to some of the others in the neighborhood. We're all fed up. We need to make a stand, or Karen's going to walk all over us." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. We needed to act, and fast. I had been trying to handle everything on my own, but it was clear now that we needed to come together as a community if we had any hope of taking on Karen and the HOA. That night, Steve and I met at my house, along with a few other supporters. We sat around the dining table, discussing our options, plotting our next move. I could feel the urgency in the room, the weight of the decision we were about to make. We weren't just fighting for our rights anymore. We were fighting for the future of our neighborhood. "We need to take this to the next level," Steve said, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. "Karen's already shown us she's willing to do whatever it takes to maintain control. But we've got the power here. The HOA may have the legal side, but we have the people." The room was silent for a moment. His words hung in the air, settling over everyone like a thick fog. It was true. The HOA couldn't force us to comply if we didn't let them. And as much as Karen liked to think she was untouchable, the truth was that she was vulnerable. "We need to organize," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Not just a small group. We need to show the HOA that we won't stand for this anymore. If we can get enough people behind us, maybe we can convince the board to rethink their approach. Maybe even push Karen out of the picture altogether." Everyone agreed. We had no choice but to make this fight public. We needed to stop hiding in the shadows, afraid of Karen's wrath. It was time to take the fight to her. We would organize a meeting with the entire neighborhood, invite people to come together, and show the HOA that we were no longer afraid. We would take back control of our community. The next few days were filled with preparation. Steve and I worked tirelessly, going door to door, speaking to neighbors, passing out flyers, and posting on social media. Slowly but surely, we began to gain traction. People who had been hesitant at first were starting to speak out, rallying behind the cause. It felt like a small spark was turning into a fire, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. Then came the day of the meeting. The turnout was overwhelming. It wasn't just a handful of people. It was the majority of the neighborhood, all gathered in one place, ready to make their voices heard. The energy in the room was palpable, a sense of unity and purpose that hadn't existed in this community for years. Steve stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd with a passion that was impossible to ignore. "We're not here to fight each other," he said, his voice strong. "We're here to take back what's ours, our right to live in peace, to enjoy our property, and to stand up against someone who's abusing their power. The HOA works for us, not the other way around." The room erupted in applause. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were all on the same side, fighting for the same cause. We weren't just a group of neighbors anymore. We were a community united against a common enemy. But Karen wasn't going to let it go that easily. She had been watching from the sidelines, and when she saw the turnout at the meeting, she knew she had to act fast. The next morning, I received a letter from the HOA, informing me that they had initiated legal proceedings to have my property inspected once again, citing new complaints about the outdoor theater. This time, they were accusing me of creating a public nuisance, claiming that the noise from my movie nights and gatherings was disturbing the peace of the entire neighborhood. Couldn't believe it. Karen had escalated things, dragging the HOA into yet another legal battle. She wasn't just content with trying to control my life. Now she was pulling in every legal loophole she could find to try to force me to comply. I wasn't going to back down. I gathered my lawyer, Steve, and a few other neighbors who had agreed to support me, and we prepared for what was to come. This wasn't just about property lines and bylaws anymore. This was about freedom, about standing up to someone who had lost all sense of what it meant to be part of a community. As the legal battle loomed ahead, I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but we had momentum. We had the support of the neighborhood behind us, and we weren't going to let Karen win. The day of the inspection finally arrived. My lawyer had prepared all the necessary documentation, and we were ready to face whatever the HOA could throw at us. I had no illusions that the process would be easy. I had spent the last few days pacing, reviewing legal documents, and strategizing with Steve and the other supporters in the neighborhood. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about proving a point to the HOA that they couldn't control us. I walked outside that morning, the air thick with anticipation, as I waited for the HOA inspector to arrive. The sound of footsteps crunched in the gravel driveway. My lawyer, along with a few neighbors, had already gathered in the backyard, silently observing. They were ready to witness the fight unfold, the power struggle between a single homeowner and an entire association that thought they were untouchable. I noticed the familiar figure of Karen in the distance, standing across the street. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed on me with that same condescending glare I had come to dread. I could see the frustration in her face. She was watching every move I made, anticipating my next step as if she believed I would back down. But that wouldn't happen. Not today. The inspector arrived shortly after, a man in his late 40s, wearing a neatly pressed shirt and carrying a clipboard. He was professional but clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the air. His eyes flicked nervously between me, my lawyer, and Karen, who was still standing on the sidewalk, just outside the boundaries of my property. "Good morning," the inspector greeted me, his voice neutral. He avoided eye contact, seemingly trying to keep things cordial. "Good morning," I responded, my voice calm but firm. "I assume you're here to inspect the outdoor theater, as the HOA has requested?" The inspector nodded. He glanced down at the clipboard, as if preparing for the barrage of questions and accusations that would soon follow. "Yes, I've been tasked with evaluating the structure to ensure it complies with neighborhood guidelines and zoning laws," he said, keeping his tone polite. "I'm fully prepared for your inspection," I said. "Feel free to take a look around. But I want you to know that I've complied with all local zoning laws, and I have the necessary permits for everything I've built." I could see the hesitation in his eyes as he walked toward the structure. His body language spoke volumes. It was clear he was caught between doing his job and being dragged into a fight he wasn't prepared for. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The HOA had underestimated me, assuming I would comply with their demands. But this time I wasn't going to be intimidated. Not anymore. The inspector walked around the structure, measuring and jotting down notes. As he moved, Karen stepped forward, her voice sharp as she addressed him. "Are you sure you're not overlooking something here?" she asked, her tone dripping with accusation. "This structure is a violation of our community's aesthetic guidelines. It disrupts the peaceful atmosphere we've worked so hard to maintain." I saw the inspector stiffen slightly. It was obvious that Karen was trying to sway him, but he remained professional, focusing on his work and avoiding direct interaction with her. "Ma'am," he said, turning toward her, "I'm just here to conduct an inspection. I'll follow the guidelines and ensure that everything is in order. If there's a violation, it will be noted." Karen's face reddened, but she said nothing. Instead, she crossed her arms even tighter, glaring at me from across the yard. I could feel her fury rising, but I wasn't about to let her control the situation. This was my property, and I had done everything by the book. As the inspector finished his assessment, he turned back to me, clipboard in hand. "I'll need to submit my findings to the HOA," he said. "But as of now, everything seems to be in order. The structure is within the legal limits, and there's no obvious violation of zoning codes." A rush of relief flooded over me, but I knew the fight wasn't over. I had expected this result. The structure was within code, and there was nothing the HOA could do to stop me. Still, I couldn't let my guard down. Karen would continue to push, and I was prepared for whatever she threw at me next. "I'm glad to hear that," I said, my voice steady. "But let's make it clear, this theater is staying. It's a part of my property, and I have every right to build it." The inspector nodded, his face a mask of neutrality. "I understand. I'm just doing my job, and I'll make sure everything is processed according to the rules." With that, the inspector turned and left, walking back to his car, while Karen stood across the street, still fuming with anger. I knew she was seething, but there was nothing she could do now. I had won this round. Later that evening, I sat in my backyard, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. The outdoor theater was lit up by the soft glow of string lights, casting a warm, inviting glow over the seats. The seating was arranged in neat rows, facing the giant screen, ready for the next movie night. As I sat there, I received a text from Steve, one of my most vocal supporters in the neighborhood. The message was short but filled with excitement. "The HOA's lawyer is scrambling. They've realized they don't have a case. You did it, man. This is going to work." I couldn't help but smile as I read the message. The battle wasn't over yet, but we were one step closer to victory. The neighborhood had rallied behind me, and even though Karen and the HOA were still trying to find ways to stop me, they were running out of options. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control of the situation. The theater wasn't just a structure anymore. It had become a symbol of everything I had fought for. The HOA might have tried to silence me, but they couldn't take away my right to enjoy my property. And as I sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized that this was just the beginning. There was a lot more to this story than just a backyard project. It was about standing up to those who tried to push us around, about showing that we had the power to take control of our own lives. The battle with Karen was far from over, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was my outdoor theater. The days following the inspection were filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. I had won the first battle, but I knew Karen and the HOA wouldn't just walk away. They couldn't. Their pride was on the line, and they'd already invested too much energy into trying to tear me down. The real test was coming. I could feel it in the air, the tension thick and palpable. It wasn't long before the next letter arrived, another legal notice from the HOA, but this time it came with a twist. Instead of simply claiming that my outdoor theater was in violation of the rules, this letter stated that they had escalated the issue to the city council. They were demanding a full review of my property, along with a public hearing to determine whether I should be forced to remove the theater. It wasn't just a letter this time. It was an official attack. I sat down in my living room, staring at the document. My heart raced, but I refused to let panic take hold. The HOA had done what I expected. They were trying to drag me through more legal hoops, hoping that the pressure would wear me down. They wanted to break me, to prove that no one was above their authority. But I wasn't about to give up. Not now. I immediately called my lawyer, explaining the situation. He listened carefully, then calmly reassured me. "This is just another tactic. They want to exhaust you, but they're bluffing. We've already won the legal battle. They don't have a strong case, and they know it." Despite his words of encouragement, I knew this wouldn't be over until I showed up at the public hearing. I had to stand my ground, not just for me but for everyone in the neighborhood who was sick of the HOA's control. This was the final showdown, the moment when I would either break them or let them break me. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and in that time I gathered my support. Neighbors who had been quiet in the past were now eager to stand beside me. Even Steve, the outspoken guy who lived a few houses down, had taken to organizing a small rally. The HOA had underestimated the power of a community united by a single cause. They thought they could silence us, but they hadn't reckoned with the resolve of a group of people who were tired of being told what they could or couldn't do. The day of the hearing, I arrived early, walking up the steps of the local community center where the meeting was being held. My lawyer was by my side, and a few of my neighbors had come along to support me. I was feeling confident, but as I entered the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The space was crowded with residents, some curious, others directly involved in the conflict. And sitting near the front were Karen and her allies from the HOA board, their eyes cold and calculating. Karen looked smug, her arms crossed tightly in front of her chest, but I could see the cracks starting to form. Her smile wasn't as confident as it once had been. She knew the tide was turning. She knew this might be the moment she lost everything. I took my seat in the back of the room, where I had a clear view of the proceedings. The city council members filed in, and the hearing began with the usual formalities. I watched as the HOA's lawyer stepped up to present their case. He was polished, smooth-talking, but his arguments were thin. He repeated the same claims, that my outdoor theater violated neighborhood standards and zoning laws, that it disrupted the peace of the community. But as he spoke, I couldn't help but notice something. The council members weren't reacting with the usual enthusiasm. They weren't nodding along, buying into his every word. There was a shift in the room, a growing sense of doubt. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. When it was my turn, I stood up, my heart steady but my mind racing. I had prepared for this moment, and I wasn't going to let the HOA push me around anymore. I explained my side of the story, how the outdoor theater was a project born out of frustration with the HOA's overreach, but also out of a desire to build something meaningful for myself and my neighbors. I talked about the positive impact the theater had had on the community, how it had brought people together, how movie nights and gatherings had helped neighbors reconnect in a way they hadn't in years. I even brought up the fact that not a single neighbor had filed a complaint about the structure. In fact, many had supported it. The real issue here, I said, my voice firm and clear, isn't about zoning violations. It's about control. The HOA wants to tell us how to live, but that's not what this neighborhood should be about. We should be free to make choices for ourselves, as long as we're not harming anyone else. I'm not asking for anything extravagant. I'm simply asking to enjoy my property, just as I've always done. I could see a few council members nodding, their expressions thoughtful. This wasn't just about legal technicalities anymore. It was about something bigger: freedom, self-expression, and the right to enjoy life without the constant interference of an overbearing organization. When I finished speaking, I sat back down, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The room was silent for a moment, and then the council members began discussing the case. I watched as Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly rattled. Her once perfect control over the situation was slipping away. The council deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but I could feel the momentum building in my favor. The board members were starting to question the legitimacy of the HOA's claims. Some asked pointed questions about the specifics of the zoning violations, and others raised concerns about the HOA's influence on community life. Finally, the council voted. The outcome was a landslide in my favor. The judge ruled that the HOA's claims were baseless and that the outdoor theater did not violate any zoning laws. The theater could remain, and the HOA was ordered to stop interfering with my property rights. It was a win, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. As I stood outside the community center, the feeling of victory was overwhelming. I couldn't believe it, we had done it. The HOA had been defeated. But as I looked around, I realized something even more important. The battle wasn't just mine. It had been a collective effort, a community that had stood together against an oppressive force. And in the end, it was that unity that had won. Karen's face was pale as she left the building, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She had lost this round, and there was nothing she could do about it. But I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA would always be a presence in the neighborhood, always looking for ways to impose their will. But now they knew that they couldn't control everything. They had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of a homeowner who is willing to fight for what they believe in. And as I stood there, watching the sun set over my outdoor theater, I knew one thing for sure. I had won not just a battle, but a victory for every person who had ever felt trapped by the rules of a small-minded association.